This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is physicalism. My guest is Daniel Stolja, and the conversation will begin in a moment. My guest is Daniel Stolja. The subject is physicalism. What is it? What is it about? And as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to just describe who they are, what they do, and why they are here to talk about it. So, Daniel, welcome. Before we get into the heavy stuff, who are you, and how did you get interested in philosophy in general and physicalism specifically?
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. Yes, my name's Daniel Stolja. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the Australian National University in Canberra in Australia. I am an Australian. I grew up here, though I did my graduate work at MIT in America, and a long time ago now. And I've been interested in philosophy pretty much since I was an undergraduate. And I wrote, a long time ago, I wrote my dissertation on physicalism about what it is and what role it plays in philosophy. And I've published a whole bunch of things on that since then. I've sort of become interested in lots of different aspects of that topic. One topic is its history, one topic is its role in philosophy, and in particular its role in philosophy of mind, what's called philosophy of mind, which is really questions about consciousness, thought, feeling, and so forth, and their role in a physical world, if any. That's the issues that I've been interested in.
So let's first define a few terms, including physicalism, obviously. Then I want to just then step back and just talk about why I wanted to talk about this, and then we'll go where the winds take us. So there are three terms that de facto, for right or wrong, are sort of used interchangeably. That's physicalism, materialism, and naturalism. Can you define those three things, but more importantly, not what they are, more so how they differ, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right that those three terms sort of tend to get used sometimes for the same thing, sometimes for different things. Let's talk first of all about the distinction between physicalism on the one hand and materialism on the other. So those ideas and those terms have very different sorts of histories. Materialism is a very old view. I mean, it's been prominent in the history of science at certain points. A materialist is somebody who thinks, as the name suggests, that everything is somehow determined by matter, or perhaps matter in motion, or matter as it exists in space and time. And the idea is that there's something called matter, it has certain properties, and that everything that exists around us is somehow determined by the properties of those things. And that seems to be true for certain objects. Like if you think of, a mountain or something, you might think, well, a mountain is sort of made up of atoms arranged together in a particular way. Atoms are constituents of matter. Maybe they just are pieces of matter. And a materialist is somebody who thinks that story about mountains is true of everything. It's true of human beings and animals and so forth, and every feature of us is sort of somehow determined by matter. So that's materialism, and materialism has a very long history in philosophy, though actually it wasn't really a dominant position in philosophy. It became a dominant position very much in philosophy in the 20th century. And pretty much became the standard view of nature and the place of human beings and other sentient creatures in nature. The word physicalism, so that's materialism, very broadly. The word physicalism has a different history. So it was actually introduced by a particular, very influential group of philosophers, mainly in Vienna prior to World War II, who were called the Vienna Circle, and they included people like Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap, Morris Schlick, various people of this kind, and they they're sometimes called logical positivists. And one of the ideas that was dominant for logical positivists was to sort of try to move away from sort of traditional philosophy, which they thought of as sort of unscientific, especially the philosophy that they were immediately reacting to, and they wanted to move away from that and think about philosophy from a very much from a sort of overtly scientific spirit. And one of the sort of casualties of that way of thinking for them was that traditional questions like the relation between mind and matter, which is exactly what materialism is a contribution to, were thought of as literally nonsense. They weren't really, they somehow didn't meet some objective standard of clarity. And so they introduced a sort of a slightly different notion called physicalism. And physicalism for them was a sort of quite a specific kind of claim where they often put it in linguistic terms. It's something like mental claims or sentences or propositions were somehow related, perhaps even translated into physical claims or sentences. That is, claims or sentences made in the physical sciences. And they thought of that as a sort of, perhaps you could think of it as a sort of cleaned up substitute for materialism. Now, what's happened since the 1930s, so since sort of almost 100 years since that period, is that the specific doctrines of logical positivism has generally been rejected by the philosophical community. And so what that meant is that a word like physicalism and a word like materialism, which for the logical positivists had very different sets of connotations and differences, sort of became kind of merged together and became, basically, as most people use the terms, they're pretty much interchangeable in their contemporary discussion. So if somebody tells you they're a materialist, they could just as easily say that they're a physicalist and vice versa. And if you read a paper about physicalism, it could easily be about materialism. There are some people who prefer the older term. The well-known 20th century philosopher David Lewis much preferred the term materialism because he thought if you use the other term, you are somehow disowning your intellectual ancestors. But most people don't have that feeling. They simply go back and forth between materialism and physicalism, and they're pretty much the same view.
But physicalism would also, though, I would think, encompass forces, say, like if we look at light, if light is thought of as light particles, then we're in the material world. But if it's waves, then it would not be material. It would be, however, physical, since waves have a physical component to them in terms of how they act upon the universe.
That's perfectly true. So the word, that's absolutely true. So another reason that sometimes people favor the word physicalism, apart from the issue about our intellectual ancestors, is that it seems more all-encompassing, and it seems more that it connects more naturally with contemporary physical theories and the way in which contemporary physical theories can change. Whereas materialism seems wedded to a sort of an older picture that is sort of historically interesting, but is sort of now out of date. That's perfectly true. Of course, as against that, you've got to bear in mind that the history of the word matter is pretty plastic as well, and it's changed as well. So, for example, a classic one is whether gravity counts as matter or not. If you read something about the history of the term at the beginning of the 18th century, it would have been thought that, forces like gravity are just not included in matter. But towards the end of the 18th century, I think a lot of people would have used the word in such a way that a materialist could easily enough believe in gravity without any compromise of their view. So even, I think, the notions of matter that are in play, at least in the philosophical literature, are pretty elastic and stretchy, somewhat in the way that the word physical is also. Because, the root word of materialism is matter. The root word for physicalism is, of course, it's either physics or physical object. It's a bit unclear what it is, and both of them have some elasticity built into them, since there are multiple different physical theories, and there are multiple different, and a physical object. What is a physical object? Well, it's a material object. So it's the connections are. It's true, there are certain connotations for physicalism, but a lot of people still use them pretty much interchangeably.
And then the third term is naturalism, and a lot of people will think of the naturalism of Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's not what we're talking about in science, though, correct?
Right. So naturalism in contemporary literature has like two or three meanings, all of which are distinct from the two that I mentioned. So both materialism and physicalism, however precisely they're understood, are what philosophers sometimes call worldviews. They're supposed to be views about the totality of existence in one obvious form. So the idea is that here we are, we sit in this kind of enormous system of existing objects and events and processes and properties. And physicalism is a thesis about the nature of that system. So that's the sense in which it's a worldview. Naturalism can be interpreted that way. And in that way of interpreting it, it's sometimes called in philosophy metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism meaning the thesis that the world is, in some fundamental level, natural. Now, of course, to articulate that, you need some contrast between the natural and the non-natural. And that's a very, very difficult contrast, actually, to clarify, because there are various different things. There's natural versus supernatural,
right,
natural versus artificial, and so forth. And so there's lots of different ways of doing it.
And also, for example, I work in retail, often in the grocery department kind of stuff. And when they talk about all natural, well, it doesn't really mean a goddamn thing. It's just advertising. But naturalism, it has the connotations of being green in this era. And that's, to me, when I hear naturalism, to me, it seems sort of a more wishy-washy term than the other two.
I think that is fair enough. It is more wishy-washy, and partly because what part of reality could possibly count as non-natural if it happens?
And then you could say, well, it was made by a human being, but we're natural. And so we're doing natural processes. So if we're canning food in a jar or something, how is that not natural? If we're natural, so there's a distinction between being man-made and natural and whatnot. But so I want to just.
I think in philosophy there's two contrasts here. One is the distinction between natural and being, as you said, man-made, or philosophers usually put that by saying artificial. So basically. An artificer, somebody who made it, and versus it just happened somehow. There's that.
Yeah.
And then there's the distinction between natural on the one hand and supernatural, where something being supernatural usually connotes something about religion or theology or some commitment to something of that sort. That's what typically counts as supernatural.
Yeah, I often argue with people. I'm someone who believes in free will. I don't buy a lot of the libertas and whatnot. But I find that people who deny free will are really sort of closet supernaturalists. But that's an argument for another day. I want to just step back and then talk about why I wanted to speak to someone about this, and then we'll get back into the main thrust here. And this is about 6 months or so ago. I wanted to talk to someone about. I stumbled across the term eternal oblivion as to death, and it said it's a theory. Eternal oblivion, which means, when you die, there's no blackness, there's no silence. Those are things. It's total inexperience, as if before you were ever conceived or born, or however you want to term it. And I thought to myself, there's something wrong with a society that looks at something that to me seems to be so obvious, and we're trying to say, well, it's just a theory, whereas if you were to say there's an afterlife, okay, give me your best estimate, whether we're talking about some scientific processes, some biochemistry or something, or whether you believe in some, again, supernaturalism or spiritism of some sort. So I was sort of taken aback about that. But then I forget what actually spurred me for this show. When I was thinking about materialism and physicalism, especially to a lesser degree naturalism, I was thinking to myself, well, what the hell else could it be? Okay, maybe it's not tiny little ping pong balls that make up atoms, or something below it or below it or below it. Maybe it is strings that quiver in one way or another and form charm quarks and this one. But by the same token, when you look at different possibilities or the things that people propose antithetical to it, they are all so much more needlessly complex, it seems to me. And that brings me to things like dualism and idealism. So, number one, on a personal level or on a professional level, do you agree with me that the that physicalism seems to me to be the most obvious thing there is? And do you look at people who then will talk about idealism or dualism? Do you wonder why they are bringing so much clutter into the mix?
Yes, I do. I mean, of course, my professional interest is in these things, so I tend to, for example, for me, when people talk about physicalism, I sort of think to myself, well, there's 17 different things that could be meant by that, and same for dualism and idealism, and so it's not sort of a straightforward comparison. I mean, the a materialist or physicalist worldview does want to say usually that in effect they take a particular physical. I mean, one problem for theories of that kind is that they take a particular physical theory, maybe the physics of the 19th century, to just pick one at random, and treat that theory as a kind of universal theory, as a theory of nature in general. And if you think about it, none of us actually believe that that's true for the physics of the 19th century, because we think the physics of the 19th century, even if true up to a point, is certainly not complete. It doesn't give us the complete theory of nature. Whereas a physicalism built on such a physics would say that that physics gives us a complete theory of nature. And likewise, if you treat other, physical theories from different points in history, the same kind of argument would apply. Even if we take the one that we currently have, or the ones that we currently have, since we have more than one, we can't. It seems kind of, epistemologically mistaken to think that they are complete. So the contemporary physics that we have can't be treated as a universal theory. And the question is, how do we actually formulate physicalism such that it's a reasonable doctrine? Some people say, well, we should take the theory that's the physical theory, whatever it is, that's true of the actual world, or maybe is true, the one that we would accept in some, imagined ideal limit of inquiry or something. And then when we can define physicalism in that term, in that way, but then physicalism becomes much more elusive doctrine than you thought at first, because if it's just that it's defined in terms of a physics that we don't know how it works, then we don't exactly know what physicalism rules in and rules out. So physicalism itself has a lot of interpretive problems that makes you think, well, it does seem intuitively the more natural position, as you mentioned, but it's still true that it has a lot of interpretive difficulties. Now, that's that side. The dualist, you might say, well, how do we reconstruct the dualist position such that physicalism and dualism are inconsistent? So the dualist traditionally is the person who isn't a materialist. So a materialist looks at human beings like you and me and says, yeah, basically they're just complicated bits of matter. Maybe they're complicated machines or something. And a dualist says, no, of course our bodies are made up of matter and are just complicated machines, but we human beings are a complex of an object of that kind and something else, maybe a soul or a mind or a spirit or something. And somehow we are a kind of unity of these two things. And now, of course, the dualist, in effect, then says that consciousness or the mind should be treated as a sort of fundamental element of nature. A bit like, gravity in Newton's physics was treated as a fundamental element of nature. Just one of the things that God had to make to build the rest of nature. And that's what the dualist is saying. And that position does seem kind of pretty dramatic. I mean, you'd need a lot of arguments for that position. And in addition, if it were true, you'd need to reassess lots of areas of our science, like, lots of areas of psychology, for example, because consciousness obviously has a big impact on psychological processes and psychological states and so forth. And if it were a fundamental element of nature, then psychology is a process and a project that looked quite different from what we might imagine. So once you think about dualism and materialism, both of them face certain kinds of issues. One is that physicalism is it's hard to, while it does seem like a very natural position, for example, for a scientifically minded person to adopt, nevertheless, when you think about it, it is much more elusive than it appears.
Well, yes, and this would certainly seem to be true in something like consciousness, because people would argue that if you are a physicalist or even a materialist, that artificial intelligence, let's say, let's put aside alien intelligences that may be out there in life as we don't know it, but if we just stick with our own artificial intelligence quest, as it seems to be a way to describe that now, there should be no particular problem. Yes, it may be very complex, and it may take more than just the next decade or two. It might take a few centuries or whatnot. But it seems to me that the physicalists would say, well, yes, their consciousness is not just about physical beings, biological beings, that there may be many paths to nirvana, that consciousness can be achieved by A, B, C, and D in certain stuff, because we don't even know what we don't know. I mean, we only have a slight grasp on how much there is, that we could, just like the claims about dark matter and dark energy, the vast bulk of what's out there that's knowable could be right now beyond us. So it seems to me that the person who is the physicalist is going to be the person who is probably more enthused about artificial intelligence, whereas someone who's an idealist or a dualist who thinks there's this spiritual component, this supernatural component, might say, no, it's just inanimate matter. You can't make metal conscious.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that's sort of sociologically true, actually, that materialists are more likely to be kind of at least open to the possibility of AI, whereas dualists may not be. But actually, even there, it's a bit more complicated than it appears initially. And that's because dualists who think that consciousness is a sort of fundamental element of nature, once they've arrived at that position, the very next thing they do is they say, of course there are laws, empirical laws of nature that connect conscious states and states of the physical, our physical bodies or any physical system. And those laws hold just like the laws of physics hold. Mm-hmm. And that a theory, an empirical theory of consciousness would tell us what those laws consist in. Now, if you hold a position, that's what contemporary dualists, typically hold. And if you hold a view like that, then as far as sort of empirical science goes, materialism and dualism can look almost equivalent because they make the same sort of predictions. Mm. And just as if the materialist says, well, in principle, maybe it's hard, but in principle, we could artificially build some system which is conscious or is intelligent or something, because after all, consciousness and intelligence are just determined by bits of matter. That's true, but of course the dualist can say something very similar, because they will say there are laws connecting consciousness and perhaps other things to physical systems. And if that's true, if we built such a physical system, then the laws would generate this consciousness for us.
Well, who is the fellow in Arizona who came up with this idea about microtubules within the organelles?
Stuart Hameroff.
Yeah, and so his thought, just to put it simply, is that there are these small parts inside whatever organelle inside the cell, and that these things somehow, especially those within the neurons, sort of give access to something physical, perhaps, but something that is sort of slightly outside of, it's not totally supernatural, but that consciousness may be derived from something we don't understand, and that these somehow filter, which oddly plays into this idea of, is it the idealists who think everything is conscious, And I've heard people use metaphors like, oh, consciousness isn't created, it's received. Like we're getting telegrams into us that are animating us. And it's like, again, wholly unnecessarily complex in my view, but I don't know. What is your take on those matters?
Well, there's a lot of complicated issues there. I mean, one thing to say is that I think there's sort of two discussions sort of superimposed on each other, and they're hard to disentangle. One is the sort of philosophical discussion about whether materialism versus dualism is true. And the other is a discussion pretty much in the science of consciousness about what are the local physical features or features of a physical system that are correlated with consciousness in some sense. And those two issues kind of cross-cut each other, because the physicalist thinks, of course, that consciousness is just itself a kind of physical phenomenon. But of course, a physicalist doesn't deny that physical phenomena can be correlated with other physical phenomena. So they can agree that, for example, conscious states might be connected or derived in certain ways from microtubules or whatever else it is. Likewise, the dualist, who thinks that consciousness is a fundamental element of nature, thinks that it's connected in a kind of by a matter of scientific laws to physical systems. And so for them, it's an open possibility that the physical systems that it's correlated with as a matter of law are things like microtubules. So that the materialist versus dualist contrast is a bit different from these proposals about what the correlates of consciousness are. There's lots of different proposals in the science of consciousness about that. And these two issues seem somewhat kind of orthogonal to each other, I would say.
Yeah, it's like some people look at human beings and consciousness as we're all sort of meat puppets in this larger Gaia system. They'll talk about the Earth being one giant system and we're a part of it. And, I've heard like that the cosmos is like an ocean, the top of the ocean, and we are just temporary waves upon it. And maybe that's true or whatnot, but they don't seem to be able to recognize that I can be both a part of the universe and yet be a separate entity myself. And I think when people confuse those things, this is why they confuse free will with determinism, because they don't see that, yes, I can be a part of a larger system, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to veer off in my own direction one way or the other.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to be part of a larger system is just simply to say that there's a whole lot of other things that you bear relations to, but it doesn't mean that you yourself don't have interesting properties sort of unrelated to the fact that you bear this relation. I mean, each of us are part of a larger system in a sense. I'm part of the larger system of Australia, but that doesn't mean that just means that I stand in a lot of interesting relations to other Australians. It doesn't mean that I don't have, I can't act as I want to. So yeah, I agree with you generally speaking about that. I suspect that when people say that kind of thing, they mean that we're sort of fundamentally part of a larger system, so that you couldn't even understand us except insofar as we were connected to these other things, and that may or may not be true. Basically, like a lot of years, there are stronger versions and weaker versions of them. And the weaker versions turn out not to be very interesting, and the stronger ones turn out not to be true.
So before I talk about your own ideas or what you seek to contribute to the discussions of these kinds of things, I have to bring up a thing that, just as a fairly well-informed layperson like myself would find very annoying in these discussions about anything science. I think one of the things I find the most disheartening with the whole apparatus of the internet, whether it's Wikipedia, whether it's YouTube videos, whether it's TED Talks or whatnot, is that there seems to be a lot less seriousness in science. We have these science communicators rather than actual scientists talking about things. Some of it I find interesting. For example, I saw Richard Feynman. There's a website or a channel that has an AI version of him talking about things based upon what he thought. And some of them, I think to myself, I'm no Feynman expert, but that doesn't sound correct. But it's at least interesting. But it's not it's not hucksterism in a sense. But I'm going to give you two terms that I find awful annoying, and then we'll get back more to the physicalism and your aspects to it. When people talk about artificial intelligence and consciousness, they talk about artificial intelligence, AGI, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. Intelligence. Right now, we're just dealing with large language models, which seem to be. It's the consensus that will never get us there. But there's other paths to nirvana. Then I hear terms like, well, artificial superintelligence. If Einstein has an IQ of 180 or whatever they ascribe to him, this will be a 2 million IQ, or it will be 1,000,000 times smarter than all of mankind. What the fuck does that mean? Because, if I as an educated layman can read books, and I used to read lots of science books, I understand about archaeology, the KT extension, I understand about stars, I love dinosaurs and stars, all the big things that a little boy did. How can you know, or how can you be 1,000,000 times smarter understanding the difference between a red giant and a yellow star?
Mm-hmm.
Where do they get those kinds of those really poor metaphors? In my opinion.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I guess in the case of intelligence, it's probably a kind of imagined idea that you can kind of measure it in a very straightforward sense, and someone like Einstein measures and has some score, and the rest of us have some lower score presumably, and super intelligence has some astronomically high score. But the mistake there is to think that intelligence is straightforwardly measurable, even if in principle one can imagine a kind of ideal position where we understand it vastly more than we do now. It could be even in principle measurable, but certainly at the moment we have got no idea, so far as I can see, how to measure it. And so these claims pretty much, I tend to agree with you that these claims sort of amount to nothing. I mean, on the question of kind of science communicators and so forth, and Feynman, you've got to bear in mind that Feynman is sort of out of the box in the sense. I mean, there are zillions of physicists that were operating at the time of Feynman who couldn't possibly do what he was doing. So he managed to both be a extremely distinguished physicist and also able to communicate about it. But that's an extremely unusual kind of property. I mean, you compare him to sort of like Leonard Bernstein, or somebody who is obviously an incredibly amazing musician, but is also capable of communicating it in a kind of incredible way. And that's just, most musicians are not like Bernstein. So likewise, most physicists are not like Feynman. It's actually true in philosophy too. One thing that happened in philosophy is that it basically just turns out to be vastly more complicated than people think when they first approach the subject. And people who are professionals at it, like me, kind of realize that, and what they typically do is break off very, very small pieces of problems and kind of talk about things and move things forward just by one step, and you're kind of 180 steps in, and that's kind of where you and your students are at, And when you kind of step back, it's sort of hard to believe that that's what's going on. And I think that means that there's a place for science communicators. Not everyone can be Feynman. And not everyone can communicate these things quite as clearly as he can. So that means there's going to be a place for it. And, the truth is that you find charlatanry there too, just as you find it everywhere else on the internet at the moment. So I think it's just pretty much a confluence of these different things. I don't think it's something to be particularly surprised at the moment.
I think they also just conflate speed with quality. Maybe you can think faster, but if you can do a crossword puzzle in 2 minutes and it takes me 12 minutes, that doesn't mean you're 6 times smarter if we both got everything right. It just means you operate quicker. And that's the thing with intelligence too, is so I can name Mozart, Picasso, Walt Whitman, Melville, Stanley Kubrick, Orson Welles. These are all artists of one stripe. But how do you determine which one is the smarter person? Yes, you might be able to say it's more difficult to write Moby Dick than it is to write a symphony or something. But again, there's gonna be some subjectivity. But they're different things. People may not be geniuses, but they may have a genius. And I think when it comes to AI, you're going to have some dumbass AIs. I mean, not every AI is going to be created equal. I mean, if you have 1,000 robots like in iRobot, some of them are going to be doofuses.
Of course, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, even if we achieve AGI, some AGI is going to, if that just means kind of intelligence in the way that we find it now, well, then there's going to be massive variation.
God forbid we get the Donald Trump of AIs.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you.
So let's get back talking though about yourself. So now you've written on physicalism. What is your contribution? Because obviously, a lot of people will write general books, but you seem to be someone who has a particular point of view. So what is your angle when you go to look at this, so that 50 years from now, society will understand this better?
Yeah, so I've tried to make various contributions to the discussion of physicalism. One has to do with the issue I mentioned before, which you might think of as the interpretation question about just what it is exactly and how it's changed over time, how we can make sense of that, how we can formulate it best. For example, one issue there is whether we can formulate it in such a way that we can think of the world as fundamentally physical at the same time as agreeing that we don't know what the nature of the fundamental physical is. And that turns out historically to be quite difficult to square those ideas.
So when you say we don't, the fundament of the physical, are we talking about what I had mentioned earlier about the difference between tiny ping pong balls and quivering strings here? Is that what you mean?
Roughly, we're talking about what the fundamental physical properties are, or what physical properties are in general. Uh-huh. And there's various questions here. One question is which properties are supposed to be fundamental? And secondly, even if we had a list of the fundamental properties, what are the properties of those properties? What can they do and what can't they do? Yeah. And those sorts of things are things that we don't currently know. But the question is that most actually clear formulations of physicalism kind of rule out those questions because they take for granted that we've got a certain kind of physical theory. And as I mentioned, we have to treat that theory as a universal theory, as answering all questions. Because remember, a worldview, what is a worldview? A worldview is a thesis about the world that gives us pretty much an answer to every question you want to know. It basically says, if materialism is true in its traditional sense, then anything that we're interested in, but let it be morality or mathematical knowledge or genius that you mentioned, or Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, anything at all, there's going to be an answer in terms of matter and motion, in terms of materially acceptable answers. And that answer will determine an answer to any question you like.
But doesn't that...
extraordinarily general position.
But doesn't that presuppose that if we're talking about physicalism, that rules out ideas of supernature, of a god. I think of, and I don't know if you ever watched the old great show from the 1960s, The Prisoner, and there was a great episode called The General, and this is a very existential. It only ran 17 episodes. It's one of these room-sized computers that the people who have captured this spy, played by Patrick McGowan, want to help program people and then program the world. And this is when people thought that human minds were basically computers. And the hero basically frazzles the whole computer by typing in a question that it can't answer. After a whole show of claiming that it can answer any question, he just types WHY. Now, a physicalist should not be able to ever really answer that. Yes, you can answer on the physical level, but why is there something rather than nothing? That seems to me to be a realm beyond physicalism, isn't it?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, that's a question, for example, about what class of questions physicalism can answer and a physicalist can answer and what class it can't. When you first state it, as I said, it's supposed to be a total theory, a theory about existence in general. Yeah. And so if it's a theory about existence in general, then it should either give an answer to this question or tell us why no answer could be supplied. So if the question is why is there something rather than nothing, let's say, then the question would be, the answer must be either it either gives us a physical answer, or it says there's no physical answer to be given, in which case the question has a false presupposition. It sounds as if it has an answer, but it doesn't really. So the physicalist, when you first state it, yeah, it's gonna provide, at least at some level, an answer to any kind of question. Now, of course, you can back off the ambitions of physicalism if you like. You can say things like, for example, in philosophy, people are very concerned to distinguish what they call the contingent nature of the world, just the way the world happens to be, with the necessary aspects of the world, like, questions about, 2 + 2 is 4 is a fact, but it's not a fact that is determined by the contingent nature of the world. The world might have contained flying pigs. It doesn't, in fact, contain flying pigs, but it could have. But it couldn't have been such that 2 + 2 didn't equal 4. And so you might say, well, really what we want to know in physicalism is the kind of contingent nature of the world, and that puts some limits on what it is. But still, it's still an unbelievably general theory. So in physics, people talk about, a grand unified theory or something. I think even that isn't quite what physicalists have in mind. So if physicalism is true, it has implications for, our moral natures, our aesthetic natures, our social life, everything. And whereas, the grand unified theory in physics doesn't really mean that. It means unifying things within certain reasonably obvious physical projects rather than this really general position. So physicalism is an incredibly general hypothesis, which, might be true, might not be true.
Yeah, and there are certain things that, for example, if we were both in grade school, we both liked the cute little redhead girl that sat in the back of the classroom. You may like her because she reminds you of some camp counselor that you had a crush on, and I may like her simply because I'm aesthetically attuned to the symmetry of her face or something. But it does end up in the same thing that we both have a crush on her. But then, how could physicalism really tackle that? Not knowing your past, not knowing my aesthetics. It seems to me that for any system, for physicalism to exist or to be successful, it would again have to. Because it does reduce everything down to a nuts and bolts approach, and yet it seems that even without supernaturalism, why do we love? Why do I love my cat? Why do you love your wife? Why do you love Shakespeare and I love Melville or something? These are these kinds of things that are sort of these wishy-washy things. I think of like some of these big stones. If you've ever seen up in the Andes Mountains, they have these stones that were dry cut perfectly, that they fit 5,000 years later. But it seems to me there had to have been some kind of grease that helped them get them into place, even if the grease is dissipated somehow. And that kind of thing, philosophically speaking, seems to be the thing that physicalism doesn't seem to recognize. Am I wrong in assuming that?
You're not wrong. Within philosophy, this topic is sometimes presented in the following way. So you say there's actually two versions of physicalism that we need to distinguish. Sometimes people say a reductionist version and a non-reductionist version. And the reductionist version is supposed to be the real hardcore, everything is just atoms in the void. And whenever you say anything like, if you happen to like Melville above all other authors, then fundamentally there's a story in terms of atoms in the void that determine this fact. That there's just something about you that we could actually investigate that way. And that's really all there is to it. That's the reductionist version of the view. And the non-reductionist version is much more forgiving. It says, there's you, that you happen to like Melville above all other authors. That's a fact about you. And we can investigate that fact without worrying about atoms in the void or anything like that. There's no requirement we could investigate it or talk about it in the way that we ordinarily do. But somehow or other, that is entirely determined. The facts of the situation are entirely determined by facts about atoms in the void. And that's a sort of what's called a non-reductionist view, because it suggests that there are kind of almost levels of reality there are levels at which there's you, kind of like in Melville, and then there are lower levels, and once you get to the very basic level, that's where the story about atoms and the void kicks in. So that these are sort of two contrasting ways to develop physicalism, and obviously the second one is a kind of it's much better at sort of saving the appearances, if you see what I mean, because it's in a way much more conservative with respect to the ordinary ways that we live our lives, because it leaves those ways intact. It just says, you know what, all of the things that the way that the world appears to us and the way we interact with it, those are all true. It's all part of reality, but reality comes in a kind of layered form, and at the bottom is a physical level, and it determines all the rest. And then the other view says, yeah, no, it's just basically the real story is physical, and that's all there is to it.
So you also deal with consciousness a lot. I see you have a book that you co-authored in 2023 called "What is Consciousness?" And for the lay public, probably the most well-known and read book of the last half century was Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained, which a lot of critics said should have been called Consciousness Explained Away. But I think that was sort of an unfair attack on him. I did interview him once, and basically his idea about consciousness was, to put it in the simplest terms, was that as the brain is processing all of this information that it's bombarded with every second, that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain's attempt to process this as best as it could. And some people will say, well, that shows that consciousness is an illusion. No, that would just be explaining what consciousness is. It's not an illusion. It's just not this mechanistic thing that you maybe thought of. It's something else. But then again, he didn't fully explain everything, and since he died a decade or so ago or whatever, does your book sort of pick up on him? Are you anti-Dennett or pro-Dennett, or just in the same vein?
I think it's probably fair to say that I'm in the anti-Dennett camp.
Yeah.
Not that I don't, I certainly admire a lot of the things that Dennett said, and especially his notion of the intentional stance seems to be extremely interesting, which we can talk about if you like. But broadly speaking, my philosophical inclinations are not in the Dennett vein at all. I'm not Dennett. It's true you could think of consciousness as an emergent property of brain systems or something, but the thing is that describing it that way doesn't really decide any of the issues that I'm interested in, because pretty much all of the positions which we mentioned could say that. Hand on their heart, the dualists could say, yes, consciousness is an emergent property of brain systems. It's just that they'll interpret emergence in a particular way. And the reductionist physicalist who thinks it's just basically atoms in the void can also say consciousness is some sort of emergent property, because they'll hear that and think of it. It's like mountains. Mountains are an emergent property of atoms because they're basically made up of atoms, and the properties of mountains are solid pretty much because atoms are arranged in the particular way that they are. And the non-reductionist that I mentioned, who thinks that reality comes in these layers, they too can say that. So the thing, one sort of criticism of Dennett is that it sounds as if he puts it that way, then it sounds as if he's sort of made a move, but he sort of hasn't really. And so I tend to think that when he says, it's true, in the end of his career, he did describe himself as an illusionist, because there is a group of philosophers at the moment who think that consciousness is an illusion in some sense. But that's a very, very obscure idea, actually, and it's not clear at all that Dennett's earlier work could be described in that way. So, I tend to be a pretty much a straightforward realist about consciousness, and I think that. So I have an attitude to it somewhat similar to the way that you mentioned before, your attitude about free will, that you think it's obvious that we have free will and the arguments against it don't seem very plausible. I think I think that is true of free will too, as a matter of fact, but I also think it's true of consciousness. And so I tend to be just a realist about these things. And so basically you have to give a theory of the world. Whatever your theory is, it's got to include the fact that consciousness exists. Dennett wanted to back off. As I read him, he wanted to back off from that, and to say, well, it exists, but not in some sense, or something like that.
And that I found there's a troubling trend that a lot of things I hear from scientists, they talk about things being an illusion. Another thing that I find just puzzling is when people say, well, time is illusion, it doesn't really flow. And what's the counter argument? That we live in a block universe. That we're in a giant block universe. We live in these time life wormholes or whatever, and at any particular time, reasonably, if there were things outside the ghost outside the cosmic machine, any entity there could enter and experience the Dan Schneider or the Daniel Stoljar experience, and there's I know what it was like the first lass that he kissed when he was 17 or 13 or whatever it might have been. I know how he felt when he got a D- on that test or whatnot. These again, it seems that things that seem to be, if not perfectly obvious, but the weight of evidence is so stacked against it. Whenever you hear the counters, they seem to be they're Rube Goldbergian. If you know that, word.
I mean, I guess I'm a little bit more friendly to the counter arguments than you are, because I think that they very often, for example, they very often can be formulated using premises that seem undeniable and using inference patterns that seem extremely sort of defensible from logical grounds. And so what you end up with is a kind of paradox, So from premises that we apparently accept and using forms of argument we apparently accept, we can arrive at conclusions which we kind of know cannot be true, like that we're not conscious, or we don't have free will, or something of that kind. And the issue then, especially for a philosopher, is to try to figure out what's gone wrong in this reasoning. And so I'm not inclined. Some philosophers, of course, in those situations are inclined to deny the existence of consciousness or free will and claim that they're illusory. I'm not of that category at all. I tend to think, no, what we really need to do is to examine the premises of these arguments and the inference steps that we're talking about, because they usually involve notions which are much harder to interpret than you might have imagined. So, for example, in the case of consciousness, people might say, well, physicalism is true. If physicalism is true, then consciousness can't really exist in the way that we think it does, so therefore consciousness must be an illusion. The arguments sometimes take form of that kind, especially if you look at them from a distance. But as we've just been noticing, the claim that physicalism is true is, actually an extremely elusive claim. It's very unclear exactly what it means and what it rules in and what it rules out. So
that reminds me of currently in physics and astronomy, the James Webb Space Telescope and a few other telescopes out there are showing us, supposedly to the beginning of time, if the Big Bang still is going to hold up. And I've got, as a layman, I've never been as big on the Big Bang, but regardless, people will look at things, for example, a star that looks to be 17 billion years old and the universe is only 14 billion or so years old. And again, it gets back to something I mentioned. There seems to be in a lot of scientific discussion the lack of acknowledgement that just because something isn't working the way we predicted, a lot of that seems to be, scientists will say, well, it's such a beautiful theory. Who gives a damn if it isn't working correctly? I'll take an ugly but real and true and proven mechanism rather than just some ideal. And that's really what idealism is. The numbers, they're so beautiful or whatnot. Well, who cares if that doesn't explain why that star is going 3 times faster around the edge of the galaxy than it should be? You don't have to. Maybe gravity works well in this type of a star, a galaxy, and it's not as well formed, or maybe it changes over time. It seems a lack of willingness to see things in the full dynamism of existence.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, or something in that vein. I think that there's a very natural tendency to confuse your models of various phenomena for the phenomena themselves.
Yeah.
And so if you really like your model, which isn't surprising because people spend ages working on them, publishing papers about it, discussing its consequences and so on, they fall in love with the model, which is totally right. But on the other hand, models bear complicated relationships to the target systems they're supposed to resemble, and often they give you only incomplete information about those target systems, and it's very easy to forget that. And I think that's roughly what's happening in those sorts of cases. I think that's very common in philosophy too, where people, overestimate pretty much the level of insight they have into the nature of reality. And a lot of philosophical problems have that, I think, as the key factor which makes you think that there's some sort of philosophical problem. So that's, you were asking before what about my contributions might be. I think one of them would be that, to try to underestimate and undermine the sense in which, when we think about philosophical questions, we often assume that in some fundamental sense all the relevant facts are in. It's a sort of conceptual question. There's no more, we can't sort of factor in our ignorance. And I think that's a big mistake. I think one should always think that we have incomplete theories of reality or intelligence or rationality and a whole range of other things. And that philosophical questions often have as their root cause ignoring that fact.
So let me just, though, turn that 180 degrees then. If there's a certain myopia that affects especially theorists in whatever field, does that rule out the idea that there may just be some things in the universe that are what are called brute facts, or just because things? What's the answer? It's just because it's that way. Do you recognize that there's also that? So we have to keep the total open mind here. We may not have all the information, but we one day may actually run into a dead end, and that's just the brute fact of it.
No, I don't see the emphasis on the idea that our knowledge in various domains is incomplete. I don't see that idea as inconsistent with the view that there are these brute facts. Because you might think, some philosophers have thought that it's kind of pretty much a priori true. You don't even need to investigate the world to find out that the world consists of a bunch of fundamental elements put together in some complex way. And really what we're trying to do when we try to construct a worldview is to say what those fundamental elements are and to say what their modes of composition are. And if you think of it that way, then it's got to be the case that there are brute facts, because the facts that concern what the fundamental elements are going to be brute. There's no further explanation for them. And maybe even the modes of composition, you could say something similar about that. So I think that the idea of brute facts is something which we've just got to accept. I don't necessarily think it's a priori true, but certainly, many forms of historically influential worldviews have included in them the idea that there must be some fundamental elements, which means there must be some brute facts. And so I think that's just an idea that we've just got to accept. Yeah. But I don't think that accepting that means that we know what they are or how they work or anything.
And you can accept the idea that there are brute facts, but you can argue over if this is one of those brute facts, whatever it is.
Sure. Yeah, right. Now, that's a very productive way to proceed. You can say, well, I think there must be some brute facts. And now suppose, for the sake of argument, that these are the brute facts. Yeah. What follows from that? Yeah. And that's obviously a very good way to investigate questions of this kind.
So before we end this interview, and I'm going to end it back talking about physicalism and its future and what you think, whether it's going to be more or less accepted through time. Let me just step back just once, because you mentioned Daniel Dennett and you agreeing with his intentional stance. Can you explain what that is briefly and why you agree with him?
Well, yeah, the intentional to take Dennett has a paper from 1971, I think, where he distinguished three stances you could take with respect to, let's say a laptop. You can take the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance. Physical stance is to think of it as a physical object and examine its physical properties and so forth. The design stance is to think of it as an artifact that has a designer, ask what its function is or its purpose is from that point of view. And the intentional stance, intentional means not having to do with intention, but in this context, it has to do with what philosophers call intentionality, which means, roughly speaking, having to do with beliefs and desires. And to think of something from the intentional stance is to attribute beliefs and desires to it. And what Dennett was pointing out is that it's sort of an obvious point now, but it's sort of extremely, for many kind of complex systems, it's kind of almost impossible for us to not treat them as intentional systems, to not take the intentional stance that, like, if you can't get your garage door down, you might say, damn thing doesn't want to come down. You're saying it doesn't want to come down. Now, you don't literally think it has wants or desires in the way that we do, but nevertheless, it's a very natural way to speak, and that's to take the intentional stance with respect to the garage door. Now, Dennett was very keen on emphasizing that this was a very natural thing for us to do. It's a psychologically very natural thing for human beings to do. You can imagine certain kind of ideas like animism, where you basically overextend the intentional stance. You think of, you take the intentional stance towards, trees and rivers or lightning or something. You don't have any other explanation for what they're doing. And it's kind of an amazingly psychologically natural thing for us to do. Now, Dennett himself thought that this fact that it's so psychologically natural for us to take the intentional stance towards things was revealing of the nature of the mind in general, because he thought that what it really showed is that the mind isn't a sort of a terribly interesting phenomenon in nature. We just sort of, if you basically, you have a mind if you can take the intentional stance with respect to something has a mind just in case you can take the intentional stance with respect to it. And so that's true of us too, so that there isn't really any big difference between us and the garage door, at least in some versions of the view. We're just physical systems that we take the intentional stance towards. Now, I don't accept that view. That's an extremely deflationary view of the mind and consciousness and intelligence and so forth. But I do think that the very idea of the intentional stance is extremely natural and important, and he's right to put his finger on it. So, for example, contemporary talk about LLMs. LLMs are complicated machines which it's just unbelievably difficult for us psychologically not to take the intentional stance towards them. And you interact with an LLM, it's just almost very difficult to do it psychologically unless you think it has beliefs and desires. But that fact is a sort of, by itself, doesn't show, of course, that they do have beliefs and desires. It just shows that we take the intentional stance towards them. And I think that idea is actually a very natural and interesting idea.
And it also seems to be something that, just again, as a layperson, seems rather not too difficult to explain, in the sense that if we grant the intentional stance to other entities out there, if we are the hunted, and that's what we were for most of our evolution, we were hunted, then we slowly morphed to become hunters ourselves. It makes a lot of sense to think of evil intent out there, as though the cosmos is out to get us. And it's like when people talk about how did religion evolve. Well, yeah, if you're scared a lot and you think, boom, there's a sound out there, and it's the devil or the monster or Scylla Charybdis or whatever it might be, you're likely going to have a lot more fearful monkeys living on. And so, anyway, so let me just ask then about physicalism. Do you think by the end of this century, will more people become physicalists or not? Or will the definition, like with most things, morph and become somehow wider or more amorphous, more rigid? What do you see evolving just philosophically in science and in society in general?
I think the second is much more likely, that it'll morph and change and so forth. I mean, as a prediction, and partly the reason for that is that that's what's happened in the past. It's morphed and changed a lot. So I think it'd be most natural to think that the same thing would be true in that case. I also think that within philosophy itself, I suspect physicalism may play less of a role in the future, because physicalism, we haven't talked too much about this, but physicalism plays this central role in philosophy in sort of articulating philosophical questions. And because one of the big projects in philosophy is just simply to state what the problems are and to see whether they're genuine problems as opposed to, problems that are just generated by confusion or something. And physicalism plays a crucial role in that. But I think one can separate out those. And I think historically people have thought that you have to be a physicalist in order to do that, but I don't think that's true. So I think physicalism will probably morph, but I also think that at least within philosophy, its influence will probably get smaller.
Well, what's the old saying about which philosophers give me a lever and a strong place to stand, and I shall move the world. Physicalism is the earth and the soil that we're moving on. That wasn't Archimedes? Who?
Is it Archimedes? Yeah, maybe Archimedes. I don't know, actually.
Yeah, well, anyway, I've got to look that up after we're done. But Daniel Stolja, thanks for spending about an hour talking to me about physicalism. It was a good conversation, so I thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Dan. Thanks for having me.